Hi everyone, welcome to MoMA's live Q&A. I'm Ellen.
And I'm Deanna.
And we're both conservators here at the Museum of Modern Art, which is where we're sitting. We're actually in the painting side of the Painting and Sculpture Conservation Studio. Paintings is your field, right, Deanna?
Yeah, I specialize in paintings.
And I'm a sculpture conservator, which means I take care of all of the three-dimensional works in MoMA's collection. And you can see sculpture is behind that glass wall behind us, where you can see all those robot arms coming down from the ceiling. We've been making videos for a while about our work that you can see on MoMA's YouTube channel. And since we got such good questions in the comment section, we decided to host this live Q&A to allow you to submit questions to us directly.
So we'll start off with some of your questions submitted on the trailer and in past videos.
For those of you watching at home, please submit your questions to us live, and our producers will pass them on to us during the stream. So that's it for introductions. Let's start with the first question.
Okay.
Do you want to grab it?
So the first question is about conserving a Frank Lloyd Wright statue. Shelby asks, how did you get the job? What schooling is required to become a restoration technician? I want to do that for a living.
And then we have another question that's sort of similar, right? From Niet Tov. I don't know how to pronounce that. How did you become a conservator? So maybe we should work backwards from that question and discuss what we do as conservators and then how we got here.
Sounds good.
So as conservators, we take care of works in the collection. And that can include treatment, like reactive treatment of a work like cleaning and repairing, but it can also be proactive work like doing taking preventive measures like advising on crates for transport, or whether a work needs a stanchion,
or controlling the environment that
surrounding
the artwork.
Right.
Yeah.
And to get to where we are today, you need some training. There are a handful of training programs in the country.
Yes.
We went to the University of Delaware, but there are a few others on the East Coast and West Coast too. And to get into these programs, you need to have a combination of training in science, humanities, art history, and studio art.
Yes. And we both went to University of Delaware, so I guess how I started in the field was actually selling tickets at an art museum and working the coat check, and I just started applying for any job related within the museum related to conservation, and eventually I applied for one job, which I didn't get, and then they called me back a few months later that there was another project, and I got that job, and it was for a studio or a storage move into new storage. And so I think just as long as you start in the arts and just keep going from there. Yeah. How did you start?
I started, well, I come from sort of a privileged position because my mother worked at a museum, so I always knew conservation existed, which is like half the battle, I think. A lot of people have never heard of art conservation. And I grew up in California, so when the Northridge earthquake hit in 1994, I derived a lot of pleasure out of putting together little tchotchkes that had fallen apart in my house. So that's sort of when the seed was planted, and I sort of buried it for a while and went on to study other things. But my junior year of college, the idea came back to me. I was doing a lot of art history, but I knew I didn't want to be an art historian, and I took a lot of studio classes, but I didn't want to be an artist either. So this seemed like a really nice way to combine both those interests.
And as far as schooling, before you get into one of the graduate programs, so in America there's 4 different programs, and they require that you have art history, studio art, and chemistry. And so you do have to do quite a bit of that work before you get into school. A good idea is to, while you're doing all your prerequisite schoolwork, to get a job related to art conservation or an internship. So you also need a lot of practical experience. So if you do them at the same time, you'll be better set when you apply to the schools.
Mm-hmm. Should we go for the next question? Let's see. Foodie Finkenster says, I'm a high school student. How did you get started in conservation and get experience? That's a related question.
And I think we were talking about this earlier, and just go visit conservation studios. Look up studios in your area. If you're on vacation, look up studios wherever you are, and just call them or email and see if you can go for a visit.
Yeah, you can find conservators in your area, and I agree. I think that's the best way, is to meet conservators and talk to them about the job and see if it's actually appealing. And that's, I think it's important to get a little bit experience in conservation before you start collecting the prerequisites to make sure that you're suited for it, because it's not for everybody. But to find conservators in your area, you can call institutions that have conservation departments. You can also go to the AIC website, the American Institute of Conservation, and find a conservator. You can do a location-based search to find conservators that are in your area, and then invite them out to coffee. Say you want to pick their brains, bring them cookies, say you want to see their labs, their studio spaces, and that can often lead to experience. And at the very least, an expanded network, which is good in any field.
So next question.
I think we have some live questions. Producer just gave us. All right, let's see. Bennett Clarkson, how do you determine which pieces are conserved or restored? What role do the curators play in the process, if any?
That's a really good question. There's a few different ways that artwork comes to our labs, our studios. One way is if there's an exhibition that the artwork will be traveling to a different city, a different museum, they'll come in to our studio so we can check them and possibly do treatment if necessary. But there's other ways too.
Yeah. If a work is slated for loan or exhibition, we're a very exhibition-driven museum. Those will be the works that come to our bench, and deciding whether to conservation and restoration, I guess, are two different things. Maybe we should tackle that.
Yeah.
So to conserve an object, it's like, I guess it's a more holistic phrase now. It can include restoration, but it's forward-looking. You're trying to preserve what's already there, and technically, we're doing that for our entire collection. That's MoMA's mission, to preserve its collection. So as conservators at MoMA, we conserve the whole collection. And we do that, like Deanna mentioned before, with a lot of passive means, making sure everything's stored correctly, that the environments are controlled, so on and so forth. But then restoration, you're returning a work to a previous condition, and that can involve loss compensation, like in painting or retouching. And determining which pieces get restored is sort of a bigger question, and that curators play a pivotal role. If there's a piece that they want to show and they're not happy with the condition, or they think the condition is distracting in some way to the presentation they want to make, then we will discuss options for restoration.
Definitely. Should we go for another one?
Yeah.
Okay, so this question is about the Yves Klein painting that was restored by our colleague Ellen Davis.
Yeah, a brilliant colleague Ellen Davis, who we lost to the Harvard Art Museums. But
Hi, Ellen.
Hi, Ellen. We miss you.
We miss you.
Very happy for you. But we miss you.
So this question comes from a name I cannot pronounce.
Disibthrope.
Disibthrope. Disibthrope says, to borrow a phrase from conservation biology, conserved to what era? As an evolutionary biologist, I would say leave it be, let it evolve. It's a good question.
Conserved to what era? It's fun to hear from a conservation biologist, because I feel like if you go to a cocktail party and you say you're a conservator, everybody thinks that you're conserving wildlife and trees. You know, they think you're a conservationist. You have to explain, no, it's an art conservator. So it's fun to hear from somebody from that actual field, it seems. Yeah. Evolutionary biologist. Conserved to what era? That is a question we certainly grapple with as art conservators. And I think the implication is that anything we do to an object is necessarily interpretive, where we bring with us our own biases and will make decisions that result in the ultimate how the work is presented ultimately, and that reflects who we are at this time, and it isn't some overarching truth that we're trying to reach. So I think keeping that in mind and knowing we can't escape our own biases, I don't think that means we should abstain from conserving, because there's some cases where you really have to intervene in some way, right?
And sometimes we intervene invisibly. So some artworks need to be stabilized. Right. And I would say that's a much more common treatment than a full treatment that changes the appearance of an artwork. And so, so I feel like if we let everything evolve, we would be left with no cultural heritage. So.
Yeah. If we took a completely passive approach, I think we wouldn't be able to show as much as we show today at the museum. But that is certainly one of the options that we consider when we're considering restoring a work. Doing nothing is a form of a decision you make in conservation too.
Yeah, and we work reversibly.
Right.
Or we try to make everything at least retreatable, which is
to allow those future generations, if they have different ideas about how something should be presented, they can alter what we've done. So, yeah.
Exactly.
Good question.
Good question.
Zodiac Josh asks, how much conservation is too much? When is it no longer feasible to restore a piece? Is it still the original artwork if it has been heavily restored? Maybe more of a philosophical question. Indeed. It's actually more like 3 philosophical questions. How much conservation is too much? I think he's talking about loss compensation.
Yeah, I
not
think
conservation
so.
per se. He's talking about like retouching or introducing some new material into a work. So how much is too much? What do you think?
So the monkey Jesus?
That's
too much.
Yeah,
we don't do that
Jesus
here.
In Spain.
Yes. No.
2012,
we don't look it up if you haven't seen it. We don't do that here. So we try not to cover any original material. We are trained, to do pretty precise work. We do little tests. We use reversible materials. So for the most part, I think, although this is a good question and we battle with the ethics.
How much conservation is too much?
I think we're trained to do a less is more approach now.
Yeah, definitely. And I think, we talk about people our predecessors of like 20 or 30 years doing these conservation treatments, which now we are backing out of and undoing, and who knows what the future generations will be doing with our bits of restoration. But yeah, like we said in the previous question, we try to work in a way that can be revisited. When is it no longer feasible to restore a piece? I haven't really faced that here.
Yeah.
I guess the paintings from the MoMA fire that are so far gone that restoring them in their current state is not really possible. Mm-hmm. I guess, and I guess in that way it's not really feasible because it can't be successful if you feel like the restoration's undermining the integrity or the authenticity of the work. Maybe it's no longer feasible. But for the most part, the museum's acquiring works that can be treated if they're not already in amazing condition. So it makes it easier on us.
Yeah.
Should we take a live question? All right. Run for Life says, I'm a pastel artist, and I'd love to know if they are hard to restore. Any tips to help pastel works last longer, or materials you want to stay away from?
I think for this question, a general piece of advice would be how you store your artwork after you've made it is really important. You definitely don't want to keep it in a leaky basement. For pastel, that would be awful. You want to keep your artwork away from bright sunlight, in an interior room if possible.
Heat.
No heat, no pets jumping on your art. That happens a lot.
No moisture.
No moisture. So that's one really important aspect. Also using good quality materials if you can helps, but obviously not everyone can use the highest quality expensive materials. So just maybe research the best way to use those materials. Yeah.
And are there materials that you want to stay away from? Like, what do you Fixatives?
Oh, yeah, maybe fixatives.
I mean,
well, no.
Pro-con. I mean,
Pro-con, yeah.
They might yellow over time, but they will help hold the pigment to the paper. It feels constricting to tell an artist to avoid certain materials in a way. Some of our most interesting art combines materials that weren't meant to go together. So, just have at it. Run for life. Yeah. Have fun.
Keep pets away.
Keep pets away. But have fun.
Have fun. Oh, this is a question we previewed earlier. Why are some of the individuals in this feature wearing gloves while handling art and others are not?
So this was at the museum episode 1, and it showed some of our conservators working on objects. Our intern Jessica Chasen working on Kusama's accumulation without any gloves, and that's painted upholstered chair. And then it showed other people, mostly preparators, wearing gloves as they prepared works to go to the Louis Vuitton Foundation. So gloves, why do we wear gloves?
So sometimes we wear gloves to protect the artwork, while other times we wear gloves to protect ourselves. So some artwork, such as medals, you should never touch without gloves because the oil from your hands can leave a permanent mark on the surfaces. But other artworks may be something that contains lead or something that contains something we shouldn't be touching. We want to wear gloves to protect ourselves. But there's plenty of things, like Jessica in the video isn't wearing gloves because that material is okay for her to touch, and sometimes you need the dexterity of your fingers without gloves in order to do this fine detail work that we do.
Yeah, gloves can mask and make it a little bit more crude the way that you work, and sometimes you need to wear them to protect yourself or the artwork. But oftentimes clean hands are preferable to gloved hands, and not all gloves are created equal. We use nitrile gloves for the most part here, and that's a fairly stable rubber. Other gloves, like latex gloves that have powders on them, some gloves are much too thick to handle objects, and so we need to choose our gloves like we do any tool carefully.
Good question.
Yeah, that's a great question. Should we take another live question? Yeah. Let's see. Naomi Silver says, do you ever get nervous working on such valuable art? What happens if you make a mistake? Is it stressful or relaxing doing such meticulous work?
That's a really good question.
Yeah, Naomi seems like she knows some conservators.
Yeah. I mean, I think obviously a healthy amount of fear is always good.
Right.
You don't ever want to be too cocky while handling precious artwork.
Yeah.
But Also, we handle so much art here that you get to a certain level of comfort, I would say.
Right. Right.
So
That's all
it's
true.
not stressful. It can be very relaxing, actually. Sometimes repetitive motions and really just doing the same thing, like rubbing a swab over a surface for a few hours is kind of therapeutic.
Yeah, no, it's great. I love that
I
kind
love
of
it.
work.
Yeah.
Um,
So I would say
I think
it's
so.
more times relaxing than stressful.
Definitely. And to the mistake question, I think we work in such a way that we manage risk. So we wouldn't be like trying a new solvent over the face of a painting with these big, broad brushstrokes.
Yeah.
We work in very small, discrete areas and always test our materials. So the types of mistakes that we can make are pretty limited.
I would say most of the time we're fixing mistakes rather than making them.
Yeah, conservators don't make mistakes. It's
doesn't
everybody
happen.
else, and then we take care of your mistakes. Yeah. But no, that's a problem with our field because it's really hard for a conservator to admit they've made a mistake because it seems like we might come across as clumsy or misinformed. It can be a little damning.
Yeah.
And that's a shame because fields learn from their mistakes. So there has been a conscious effort, I think, within the field to be a little bit more transparent about
Yeah.
mistakes that are made. But again, like the vast majority of those mistakes are totally reversible because we work in sort of a reversible way,
Yeah.
right?
And we do so much testing before we even touch the artwork in an overall sense that if a mistake happens, it's early on in testing stages.
Yeah. Yeah, sure. Whatever you want.
Oh, I got two. Okay, so Zoe asks, and this is from At the Museum episode 1 video, is that a special flashlight they keep using? Does it use a different hue or wavelength of light? It's an odd looking flashlight. So we brought some of these odd looking flashlights for you to look at.
So that's the one she was just in the video, right?
Yeah, so this is, these are just two different types of flashlights we use. This is just a regular flashlight, a good intensity to look at surfaces of objects, to look for damages, things like that. And Ellen's holding a UV flashlight. So this tells us different types of information.
Yeah, shining a UV light on a surface will give you information you can't see with regular light. Sorry,
Yeah.
UV radiation.
Radiation.
Yeah. So, yeah, with the UV, do you call it a radiator then? It's radiation.
Radiator.
With the UV
Ray gun.
torch, you can see like things that you can't see in normal light. Like I said, like past retouching or a varnish that's been applied that is transparent in regular light. And I love this style flashlight. There are other flashlights out there on the market, and there's nothing like particularly special about this design, but I think it really helps look at vertical surfaces.
Yeah.
So you don't have to like tilt your wrist in a weird way if you're using a more traditional
Yeah, this
torch.
is a good shape for us.
What other tools do we have here?
Let's see. So,
Do you want to just bring this forward?
Yeah.
Oh my God, that's heavy. It has weights in
it
it.
has weights in it. So people ask us about tools a lot, so we thought we'd show you a couple of our favorite tools. For example, a dental pick. We borrow a lot from other professions. There's very few things, there's a few things, but very few things we use just made for conservators. So different types of dental picks are our favorite things.
Tiny brushes for in painting and retouching, but also for filling fine cracks with a filling compound or seeping adhesive under lifting paint, one of my favorite activities.
Sometimes we even reach for a porcupine quill. It's just a very sharp pointed tip that doesn't dull quickly, so that's a really good one. What else? We have
an agate burnisher, which has a stone at the end that can, if you rub it over a fill, you can get it very, very smooth. So it's really handy for filling like losses in gilding to gesso.
Burnishing
Burnishing.
different types of paint,
Yeah.
and gilding.
You can sort of make paint look almost plasticky if you're
Yeah.
working on like a McCracken or something.
It's great. Different types of scalpel blades are also something we use a lot. We use this for all sorts of things, removing accretions, taking microscopic samples, things like that. So these are really great.
This one's so tiny. Is this one of the corneal scalpels?
Yeah, so for example, this scalpel is actually borrowed from probably eye surgery tools. So that's really interesting. We use tweezers all day.
Yeah, tweezers are great.
Tweezers, micro spatula, and we have all kinds of sandbags. So we actually, this is for scuba diving. So we borrow a lot from different fields. So actually, in the comments below, if you have any cool tool you think we should
that's a good idea.
Try out, let us know.
Yeah, that's a great idea.
Yeah.
And I want to say that this is a tool I learned from my colleague Megan Randall, who learned it from another New Yorker conservator. It's actually to use a Metro card to help finish fills. It's got a very thin edge, so you can almost use it like a blade, but it's soft, so it's not going to damage your substrate if it's prone to scratching. You can also use it for cleaning. I've used it to take gunk off of the top of a box in an installation piece. It was just the right strength and thinness to get the gunk off without damaging the surface. So yeah, this is one of my favorite tools.
You can probably also cut it into weird shapes and then stick it onto a stick with some duct tape.
That's a really great invention. I think you're sitting on $1 million idea.
And then this is just an example of a palette we use with some gambling conservation colors. We use all different types of paints depending on what we're working on. So it's gray. Gray kind of helps you see, it's not stark white. It helps you kind of see if you're putting white on top of a different color, you're going to have different effects. Rally scattering, I think it's called. So
rally scattering.
Rally scattering. So it's nice to use a gray palette, and so this is one example. We also have our everyday watercolor set, and these are great because they're quite reversible in just water, and you can use the tray as a palette itself.
Do you want to ask or get some more questions?
Yeah. Ooh, this is a good question. FF Boda asks, what are the main challenges of contemporary art conservation? It's a really good question.
Yeah, contemporary art conservation as opposed to more traditional forms of conservation. Well, first off, there are a lot more materials since the Second World War, so we're dealing with a huge range of polymers and plastics that really haven't been tested by time. We don't know how they're going to age and how they get along with other materials. So the number of materials that we're responsible for is infinitely larger than it would be for somebody working on objects from the early 20th century and before.
Yeah, we're also dealing with something that's really cool is the artists might still be alive, and so documenting the artist's intent in documenting just how the artist's work might be part of our documentation process, whereas before, obviously, that was impossible. So it's a really exciting time, and I think we're all kind of learning as we go.
Yeah, yeah. And the ethics aren't as cut and dry, right?
Yeah.
We're not always trying to preserve the material. We're not as precious about the material as we might have been for more traditional objects, because there are some objects that demand they be remade every time they're shown. And there are others whose material is just disintegrating. So it would be preferable in some cases to actually remake or replicate than to preserve that material.
Yeah. Maybe like, for example, our colleague Megan Randall was working on a wax leg by Robert Gober. And I wasn't here at the time, so I don't know if you...
Right, the wax leg had little human hairs sticking out of it, and it goes into, the part of the installation is it goes into a bathtub and bath water runs over it, and the hairs from the pressure of the water get dislodged and pulled out. So rather than fishing out those scuzzy hairs in the, in the bath and finding out where they came from and putting them back in place, it was preferable from the Gober studio and our curatorial team to replace that hair with new hair that they supplied Megan. And they, someone from the studio came and trained her on how to insert human hair into a wax leg, and it was really disgusting.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's something totally new.
Right. Right. The learning
really
curve
fun.
is very steep, which is what makes it interesting.
Yes.
Yeah. All right, got another live question here. From Kat, how has conservation changed in your careers as materials and techniques evolve? Have past conservators unknowingly done damage to art? Two great questions.
Yeah.
And the first one is related to what we were just discussing, how there are all these new materials and techniques. And I think we're lucky here at MoMA because we have our science conservation department upstairs. And so if we have materials that that come in with a new acquisition, we're not sure what they are or how they might react, we can send them up for analysis, and that can inform the materials we use and our understanding of that artist's practice.
Yeah. And also the materials we use, because of new plastics and new resins and things like that, like you were saying, we have such a broader choice when it comes to like varnishing or when it comes to adhesive. And so I think that feeds into the second question. I don't think it's fair to say that past conservators did damage at all. I think they just didn't have the same tools that we might have now. So they were doing their best at the time with what they had around them to use.
Right. But yeah, as we said before, a lot of what we do is undoing past restoration attempts that where materials have failed, and undoubtedly
that will happen.
We'll be on the other end of that equation in the future. Hopefully less and less as we learn more and more. But at the same time, the materials are evolving as our understanding of them is, so it's hard to keep up.
But we try our best.
We try our best. Sure.
Ooh, this one's for Ellen. Alexis asks, and this is in regards to conserving a Frank Lloyd Wright statue. Okay, but what happened to her head restoration? Rolling eye. Rolling face. So what did happen to her head?
Alexis Thomas is among, I think, several viewers who watched this video that we posted about this Frank Lloyd Wright sprite with a missing head. And it was all about our restoration of this headless sprite. But at the end of the video, we hadn't replaced the head. We were focused on this crack system at her midsection. And yeah, we never did replace the head. And that's because we were preparing this work for an exhibition that didn't really require a perfect restoration. It was for Frank Lloyd Wright at 150, unpacking the archive. So it was all about how the archive, Frank Lloyd Wright's archive, came to MoMA in Columbia, and how we were interpreting the objects in that archive as sort of raw data. So to the curator, Barry Bergdahl, it wasn't all that important that presenting this sprite, we were presenting it as this entire piece, because we received a lot of objects that were in various states of condition, and that was sort of part of the challenge of unpacking the archive. So you can understand how a partial restoration might be acceptable in this presentation, but that's not to say that we won't restore the head in the future. And I can imagine a lot of different types of exhibitions where we would want to, like one about Midway Gardens, the project the sprite came from, and how Frank Lloyd Wright worked with concrete, and how he cast concrete. In that sort of presentation, it might be nice to show his intended result.
But if you were to restore the head, you wouldn't just invent a head, right? You would look at a lot of documentation and other sprites that still exist.
Yeah, that's a good point. There is an abundance of historical evidence of what that head looked like, and other existing heads, so we could definitely use that, molds of those heads, scans of those heads, to inform how we recreate ours, because this one sprite came from, is one of 20 or so that came from the same mold. So that's lucky for us.
Yeah.
If we didn't have any evidence of the head, then we might not attempt to restore it, period. I have another live question. Enigma writes, is all of the work/restoration due to age-related reasons? Do things ever happen because of accidents or anything like that?
It's a really good question.
Is all of our restoration due to age-related reasons? Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'd say, I don't know, a quarter of the works that come to our lab are because of damages and not because of deterioration, because of handling, or something fell off of its pedestal due to vibrations.
Yeah, and sometimes age makes an artwork more susceptible to damage, so that's important to think about. But yeah, sometimes we do have to fix careless accidents.
The euphemism we use is visitor interaction. For when a work has been damaged due to an overzealous visitor, or a clumsy visitor who was taking a selfie.
Yeah. But that's a really good question.
Another live question from Devon Coley. Are either of you and your colleagues practicing contemporary artists? No. And if yes, does being a conservator positively or negatively impact your art-making career?
Yeah, so I was actually a painter before I became a conservator.
Really?
Yes, I was an oil painter, and...
Like figurative or abstract?
I would say figurative, but surreal.
Cool.
But the problem is I'm actually currently still a graduate student, and the conservation program is quite intense, and you have to give a lot of your time to it. So in that sense, negatively affected my practice because I just don't have time to paint. But I think after I've graduated this summer, I will go back to making art. And I think I'll honestly keep doing what I was doing before.
It's had no impact.
It's I think we learn a lot of traditional techniques during school, so we learn how certain paintings were made, how certain sculptures were made, and I think, maybe I'll have picked up a little bit of that in my own practice. But I know other conservators are really influenced by, say, old master artists.
Yeah, and I'm not an artist. I loved my studio art classes. I love working with my hands and honing a skill. But I always had trouble with coming up with a concept facing a blank page. That was never my strength, and I don't have any inclination to create in that way. So conservation's perfect because the art's already there, and I can work within that that framing. But I think working in conservation has impacted the way I view art. I think it makes it much harder just to appreciate a painting or sculpture if you can see the damages and knowledge of the types of damages that can happen, and what old restoration looks like. I think really I can't unsee that now when I look at a work that has any sort of
and I like that point. I think conservation, going through the program and learning all about materials, has really made me love modern and contemporary art so much more than I did before, because I'm so much more aware of the importance of materials and the importance of different techniques and subtle things like that I might not have noticed before. So when you're in a gallery next time, really look at the materials and the choices the artist made on how they use those materials.
Cool. Yeah, should we wrap up? I think we're running out of time.
Should we look at this last?
Oh, there's one more. Let's see. Oh, I see. This is from our producers. We're new at this. We don't understand that this was supposed to be subtle and not read out loud. This is just a note to us. All right. So we just want to give a quick shout out to our viewers tuning in across the U.S. and internationally. We have viewers from New York City, of course.
South Carolina. Hi.
Maine.
Turkey.
India.
And Slovenia.
Very cool.
Thanks for tuning in.
Yeah, thanks so much. Thanks so much for all the great questions and comments that you guys sent in.
Yeah, and if you enjoyed this video, please check out our other videos in the conservation playlist.
Yeah, and keep sending in questions. And to any conservation colleagues who are watching today, please post any resources that you think might be valuable to pre-program students, anybody interested in conservation.
If we forgot to say something,
we certainly forgot. We didn't mention the ECPN, the Emerging Conservation Professional Network, which is also a great thing to get involved in. Go to the AIC webpage. But yeah, any conservators watching, link to resources below, or any favorite books, anything you think that would be useful for an emerging conservator. And yeah, hit that subscribe button below so that you'll be sure to catch our next release. Thanks so much.
Thanks so much for watching.